Thank you, Candace, and thank you for inviting me back up here again. This is my third trip up here. I think the first one was on the 10th Mountain Division. How many people attended that lecture? Goodly number. How many attended my second lecture on Colorado and the Civil War? Not as many, okay. We do have books over there on the table, as Candace said, that cover those two topics. And also, I brought a number of other books with me as well. Interestingly enough, I don't have a book on this topic. I can recommend one, but I haven't written one, but it kind of sprang out of my Colorado and the Civil War book, because many of the characters that I will introduce to you tonight play feature roles in my Civil War book called Distant Bugles, Distant Drums. But I want to give you a little bit of background about me. I live in Denver now for about the last 49 years. Grew up in the Chicago area, and then, yeah, go Cubs.
Hell yeah.
Or White Sox, there was somebody said White Sox out there. And after I graduated from the University of Illinois in 1964, yay, go Fighting Illini. All right. We're never going to get to this talk. You know. After I graduated from the U of I in '64, I took my ROTC commission and went into the Army and spent 5 years. I had 2.5 years in West Germany and a year in Vietnam. And then the Army sent me to Fort Carson in the Springs for my 5th and final year before I reverted to civilian status. And then I had about 30 years in the advertising business. My actual degree is in graphic design and commercial art, but I was always as much a writer and a historian. And I couldn't decide, you know, when I had to declare a major where I wanted to go, but I thought, well, maybe I have a better chance of getting a job in advertising than I would teaching history. But I've been able in my life now to combine all of those loves. I have 16 books that have been published. I'm working on 2 more at the present time. I had been the editor of a magazine called World War II Quarterly for 12 years until it ceased publication in October. I'm sad about that, 12 years of that. I also lead battlefield tours for the Smithsonian and lecture aboard Viking cruise ships. And I'm going to be doing a D-Day trip for the Smithsonian come this next May and June, the 80th anniversary of D-Day. I'm on the board of directors of the Broomfield Veterans Museum, where I get to design exhibits, and so I get to use some of my art education in that. And in 2021, I became the first military historian to be inducted into the Colorado Authors Hall of Fame. So. That and $6 will get you a beer at the back table. Usually, I sprinkle my talks with some humor, but there's not much humor in tonight's talk. I was driving up from Denver today, beautiful day, the sun was out, high wispy clouds and a trace of snow on the fields as I was driving along, and I was thinking, God, this is so beautiful. This is such a gorgeous place. And it struck me, because of the topic that I'm going to talk about tonight, that this is really somebody else's home that we are in right now. And I think as we go through the talk tonight, you will get a sense of what we owe to previous generations, what we owe to the Native Americans, and there's a lot of sadness involved in this. At History Colorado down in Denver last year, they opened an exhibit on Sand Creek, and it was one of the most powerful exhibits I've ever been to. I had tears in my eyes when I left the exhibit, because It's Sand Creek written from the point of view of the Native Americans. Anybody here, have you been to that exhibit? 3? Nobody over here. Next time you're in Denver, I would highly recommend that you make a stop at History Colorado and check that out. Sand Creek is just one aspect of centuries of attempts by the European invaders, our ancestors, to eradicate the natives and steal their land. As a former Army officer, I'm chagrined and ashamed of the past transgressions that we've deliberately inflicted on those who called this continent home for thousands of years. It's not a glorious story, for the bad guys turned out to be us. In my presentation today, I'll try to give you a balanced view using some of the material that History Colorado has on display. And like I said, I highly recommend that you go to see it. Today I'm going to divide my talk into 3 sections. This is what you see at the beginning of the exhibit at History Colorado, the Sand Creek Massacre, the betrayal that changed Cheyenne and Arapaho people forever. The first part of my talk is the historical background to Sand Creek. Second, I'll discuss the actual attack on November 29th, 1864. And lastly, I'll talk about the aftermath and how, as the History Colorado exhibit says, it changed the Arapaho and Cheyenne people forever, and it also changed us. So, first, the historical background. Before the arrival of the white man from Europe in the 1400s, over 1,000 native tribes resided in what we today call America, or the United States, and had been here from 25 to 30,000 years. Today, the number of tribes is down to about 574 nationally recognized Native American tribes. Most scholars place the pre-Columbian population in North America at between 12 to 18 million, but no one knows for sure. By 1700, the native population had been decimated by diseases brought by the Europeans, and they may have numbered only about 2 million then. The natives were spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific and north into what is now Canada and south into what is now Mexico. They inhabited forests and deserts, mountains and swamps. Some tribes had permanent settlements and cultivated the land and grew crops such as corn or maize and raised animals, while others were nomadic and followed the buffalo herds, relying on their hunting and fishing skills to provide food for their families. But not all of the tribes were peaceful, as you see in this slide. Many fought vicious battles with their neighbors. There was no common language and no overall government. When the whites arrived uninvited on the continent and the first colonies were established, it was a shock to the natives' collective systems. Some tribes resisted the invaders while others tried to make peace with them. Spanish conquistadors arrived on the continent in the 1400s and 1500s and explored much of what we call the Southwest, primarily looking for gold. In the guise of trying to be fair with the natives, the Europeans drew up treaties that promised certain benefits in exchange for the natives giving up what the whites wanted most, land. We've probably all heard that in 1626, or so the story goes, indigenous inhabitants sold off the entire island of Manhattan to Dutch settlers for a tiny sum, just $24 in beads and trinkets, or 60 guilders, the Dutch currency at the time, the equivalent of more than $1,000 today. It turns out that this is probably a myth. Most of the treaties, however, were broken by the whites when doing so was to their advantage. As more and more Europeans crossed the Atlantic and gobbled up large tracts of land, many of the indigenous tribes were pushed ever westward. Or some of the Indians chose to stand and fight as the intruders, such as during the Jamestown Massacre of 1622. We'll jump ahead a century to the French and Indian War, the North American phase of the larger 7 Years' War between Britain and France. It began after a series of incidents in the upper Ohio River Valley in which the French and British governments both claimed as their property. It ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The war provided Great Britain enormous territorial gains in North America, and paying the war's expenses led to colonial discontent and ultimately to the American Revolution. In the early 1800s, the US government authorized explorations into the West. In 1804, Thomas Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their historic journey to the Pacific Northwest. Zebulon Pike's expedition west in 1806 took him into what is now Colorado. Additional expeditions followed over the next few decades, bringing more and more whites into what had been the natives' exclusive territory. In 1823, the US Supreme Court decided that Indians did not own the land. They could not sell it. They had no right to it, which I think was a terrific blow to the rights of the Native Americans. In 1833, a trading post known as Bent's Fort was established on the Arkansas River by the Bent brothers, William and Charles, and their friend and business partner, Saran St. Vrain. Here's an early map showing the location of the fort. It's right on the Santa Fe Trail and the Arkansas River, the main highway between northern Mexico, Santa Fe, and Independence, Missouri. How many of you have ever visited the reconstructed Bent's Fort? Okay, goodly number. It was patronized by both whites and natives and was an important part of the economy of this region. William Bent, who was married to a native woman, had a son named George, who will figure in the upcoming Sand Creek drama. A phrase coined during the James Polk administration in 1845 was manifest destiny, a cultural belief that white Americans were divinely ordained to expand their domain and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. By the 1840s, whites had expanded all the way to the Mississippi River and beyond, building settlements wherever they went and pushing the natives farther and farther from their traditional homelands. As the wagon trains snaked ever westward, they were often accompanied by soldiers who built forts near the white settlements and acted as a police force to protect the settlers from the displaced natives. Some tribes naturally resented and resisted this incursion and attacked the trespassers. The Indians were usually portrayed as hostile savages, the aggressors, when all they were trying to do was defend their homeland. At times, the two sides got along, especially when it came to trade that was beneficial for both the whites and Indians. But more often than not, the two sides would enter into a treaty only to have the US government unilaterally break it if doing so was beneficial to the white settlers. As years went on, one treaty after another was broken. And when gold was discovered in California in the late 1840s, and then what became known as Colorado a decade later, it brought even more Easterners pouring westward and more tension between the whites and Indians, as they were now collectively called. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 had given the land lying between the Platte and Arkansas rivers and between the Rocky Mountains and the Smoky Hill River country to the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in perpetuity. In this case, however, perpetuity ended up being less than a decade. In 1858, prospectors illegally entered Cheyenne and Arapaho land to search for gold. Once gold was discovered, over 100,000 other whites invaded and established settlements on land that was home to the Cheyenne and Arapaho. The new sweep of immigration to the Rocky Mountain region during the Colorado Gold Rush of 1858-59.
Excuse me just a second. I have to make just a quick announcement. Is there an Austin Carmen in the crowd by chance? Hi, so they're doing pickup and drop off of all the skiers, and I guess there's many cars that are problematic, but yours is the most problematic. Do you mind going to move it? Thank you so much. Sorry.
No problem.
You got me.
So the Colorado Gold Rush of 1858 and 59 demanded a new treaty, the 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise. In 1861, the Treaty of Fort Wise was made with the American Indians in the Colorado Territory to restrict their access to their hunting grounds, relocate them to a reservation, and encourage them to grow crops in exchange for provisions. You'll see on this map, we have Fort Wise/Lyon. Well, at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, the name was changed from Fort Wise to Fort Lyon because Wise was a governor of Virginia, which was a southern state, and it was not thought prudent to have a fort in the west named for him. There were periods of crop failures at this time, and the government did not honor its agreement to provide provisions. Tribes began stealing food and livestock in order to survive. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were restricted to a small triangular reservation in southeast Colorado, a desolate area bounded on the south by the Arkansas River and on the east by Sand Creek. Its only redeeming feature was that it still supported great bison herds, although most Cheyenne expected that the herds would likely disappear within a generation. In 1861, the U.S. government created the Territory of Colorado out of portions of the Utah and Kansas territories. Massive herds of bison roamed the Great Plains that the Plains Indians, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Ute, the Pawnee, the Lakota Sioux, and others relied on for food and hides that were turned into tents and blankets and clothing. The Northern Cheyenne lived in the territory north of the Arapaho and often intermingled and traded with them. The two tribes also often fought together against the Lakota, the Kiowa, the Comanche, and other Plains Indians. The wide open plains were increasingly taken over by cattle ranchers. Farmers and sheep ranchers came too and fenced off the wide open spaces. There was a serious clash of cultures. As I said before, although the U.S. government had signed treaties with the native inhabitants to respect their lands, too often the treaties were broken, the land given or sold to settlers, and the natives forced onto reservations where there was little or no way for them to exist. Although the word extinction was rarely, if ever, uttered in the halls of Congress, that seemed to be the goal of the government. The nomadic Plains Indians continued to have their land confiscated by the settlers, who were at the mercy of the Indians, who sometimes became hostile towards the intruders. In 1860, Lincoln was elected President of the United States and inaugurated in 1861, and the war between the states broke out immediately. Both sides wanted Indian tribes to join their cause, but most tribes remained neutral. Lincoln decided that he needed to protect the fabulous silver and gold fields here in the West from the Confederates, and he was right on time because the Confederates had launched an invasion from Texas up through the Rio Grande Valley through New Mexico and on their way to Colorado. To preclude this from happening, Lincoln appointed this man, William Gilpin, to be the first Colorado territorial governor. Gilpin managed to raise a 1,000-man regiment to save Colorado for the Union. The Texans were turned back after a 2-day battle of Glorieta Pass outside of Santa Fe in March of 1862. But Gilpin was ousted as governor by Lincoln when it was discovered that he had used some unauthorized methods of paying for the weapons and wagons and other accoutrement of war that the Colorado troops needed. In Gilpin's place, Lincoln appointed Dr. John Evans of Illinois. Evans was a distinguished physician and an abolitionist and a personal friend of Lincoln. He had founded the city of Evanston, north of Chicago, and Northwestern University, where my grandson goes. He also started a railroad and became wealthy, and so he was able to drop his medical practice. He would later found the Colorado Seminary, which became the University of Denver. In addition to being governor of the Colorado Territory, he was also the territory's superintendent of Indian Affairs. With the West secured, Lincoln turned his attention to the war still raging in the East and spent little time thinking or worrying about the Indians. Despite many admirable qualities, President Lincoln fell short when it came to his relationship with the indigenous peoples. His grandfather was killed by the Indians, and he had enlisted himself to fight in the Black Hawk War of 1832, a fight over tribal lands in Illinois, but he did not see combat. In 1862, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, thus unilaterally breaking a treaty with the Cheyenne and Arapaho by taking away their homelands and giving away millions of acres to settlers and railroad companies. Historians have pointed out that Lincoln was a reactionary when it came to Native American issues, making and breaking treaties, confiscating native lands, forcibly removing natives, and turning a blind eye on the genocidal acts by the military on the western frontier. Lincoln signed acts into law that gave away millions of acres of tribal land to support white westward expansion. Historian Christopher Anderson wrote, Lincoln's acceptance of U.S. Indian policy indicated he conformed to the general social attitudes toward Native Americans in his time. He continued to view them as a foreign people that would need to be removed through purchase or conquest. During his time in the White House, he displayed the common paternalistic attitude that the Indians needed the white man's civilizing influence. In March of 1863, when hosting Plains Indian delegation at the White House, Lincoln told them, I can see no way in which your race is to become as numerous and prosperous as the white race, except by living as the white race does, by cultivation of the earth. In other words, shut up and be farmers. In 1864, there were ongoing clashes between whites and Indians on Colorado's eastern plains. The citizens of Denver City and other Colorado towns were demanding that the governor do something to protect them. And you can imagine if we had Taliban or ISIS groups in Colorado, you would probably call up the governor's office and say you need to do something about it. So this was the attitude that the white settlers had at this particular time. Former Colorado State historian David Hallis wrote, when it came to Indians, Evans believed that they didn't have souls, that they were heathen savages, that they were infernal. In 1864, Evans issued a proclamation that authorized all citizens of Colorado to go in pursuit of all hostile Indians and kill and destroy all enemies of the country. Pretty harsh declaration there. Evans then turned to a man who had distinguished himself at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in New Mexico 2 years earlier, and was now the commander of Colorado militia troops, and asked him to come up with a solution. The man was John Milton Chivington, a former Methodist minister. Chivington's solution was to kill Indians wherever they were found without determining whether or not they were peaceful or warlike. At about this same time, an incident occurred that would change history forever. A band of Indians, possibly a group known as Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, attacked a ranch near the present-day town of Elizabeth, about 30 miles south of Denver, and murdered and mutilated the wife of Nathan Hungate and their 2 children, set the buildings on fire, and stole the cattle. The Hungate bodies were brought into Denver, publicly exhibited in order to arouse fear and anger among the citizenry. Bending to the outcry of the citizens, Governor Evans authorized Colonel Shivington to form a group of Indian fighters to punish the natives. They weren't even real soldiers. They were called the 100-Day Regiment, men who joined up for a few dollars and the chance to quench a bloodthirsty desire to kill Indians. As a result, rather than diffusing the situation, clashes between Indians and whites became more numerous. Major Ned Wynkoop, the post commander at Fort Lyon on the Arkansas River, was approached by a chief named One-Eye and urged to organize a peace council with Evans and Shivington in an effort to ease the tensions. On September 28th of 1864, the delegations came under Army escort from the Eastern Plains to meet at Camp Weld in Denver. Several chiefs were part of this group, including White Antelope, One-Eye, and Black Kettle, the chief of the Cheyenne. Also present were Major Wynkoop, commander of Fort Lyon, and Captain Silas Sewell, commander of the 100-man Company D, 1st Colorado Cavalry Regiment, stationed at Fort Lyon. Wynkoop had been a company commander during the Civil War battle at Glorieta Pass under Shivington. Wynkoop and Sewell also wanted peace. Sewell's family had been friends with abolitionist John Brown. They helped Brown at Harper's Ferry, helped escape slaves on the Underground Railroad, and he was a member of an abolitionist militia in Kansas before moving to Colorado. During his tenure as post commander at Fort Lyon, Wynkoop encouraged peace efforts with the Cheyenne. Wynkoop had issued them rations and allowed them to trade with locals in preparation for winter. But peace was not on the minds of Evans and Shivington. After promising the Indians that they would establish an encampment on the eastern banks of Sand Creek, its actual name is Big Sandy Creek, about 170 miles southeast of Denver, and fly an American flag and a white flag above their encampment, Wynkoop's troops at Fort Lyon, 40 miles to the southwest, would protect them and provide rations for them. But it was a ruse. Protecting the encampment was the last thing that Evans and Shivington planned to do. Black Kettle and other Cheyenne chiefs gathered non-combative tribal members and moved them toward Fort Lyon. Wynkoop was between a rock and a hard place. He was trying to serve two masters, Governor Evans and General Samuel Curtis, commander of the Kansas district under whose jurisdiction Fort Lyon lay. Curtis had sent a telegram to Shivington at the time of the Camp Weld conference that said, "I want no peace until the Indians suffer more." In early November 1864, Curtis relieved Wynkoop of his command at Fort Lyon after hearing rumors that the major had disobeyed Field Order Number 2, which expressly forbid post commanders from allowing Indians to enter or camp near a military fort. Curtis was apparently unaware of Governor Evans' order directing the Indians to establish a camp near Fort Lyon. Major Scott Anthony replaced Wynkoop as commander of Fort Lyon, and Wynkoop went to Fort Riley, Kansas. And here's General Field Order Number 2. It was issued in response to the dog soldiers of the Northern Band of Cheyenne and Sioux warriors' declaration of war on white settlements in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. The order directed fort commanders to step up protection of both private and military lives and property. The directive also ordered post commanders to forbid all Indians and their allies from approaching forts unless they were intercepted and blindfolded before proceeding. This added measure was intended to prevent Indians from spying and ascertaining troop strength at the forts. And now comes the attack. The Sand Creek encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho consisted of 113 tents or lodges and about 650 men, women, and children. Following an earlier order by Major Anthony, the Indians had turned in whatever mules and horses they had stolen from the whites, and also their rifles that then was supposed to show their peaceful intent. Although they had not yet been authorized to leave Denver, Shivington ordered his ragtag contingent of over 500 Indian fighters to leave Camp Weld and begin a week-long march to Fort Lyon. When he reached Fort Lyon on November 26, Shivington was greeted by the new post commander, Major Scott Anthony, who had also served under him at Glorietta. There were about 250 soldiers of the Colorado militia stationed at the post, including Silas Sewell's company and a company of New Mexico infantry. Shivington ordered Anthony to prepare his troops to ride under cover of darkness to the camp on Sand Creek, along with his own band of Indian fighters, where they would attack the camp. On the night of November 28th, the Shivington force, numbering roughly 650 to 750 men and towing 4 artillery pieces, left Fort Lyon and made the 40-mile march to the sleeping encampment. Positioning his men on the south and west sides of the camp at dawn, Shivington ordered his men to attack. The camp's inhabitants were, of course, taken completely by surprise. Not all of the Indians' firearms had been turned in, and so a few of the Indians began firing back. Many of them also had bows and arrows. They were outgunned, of course, and Army bullets and cannonballs began tearing through the camp, followed by men on horseback shooting Indians at point-blank range and setting lodges and tents on fire. Chief Black Kettle flew the American flag and a white flag on a pole in front of his lodge, but they did no good. Here's an Indian drawing showing one of the soldiers shooting and killing an Indian at the flagpole. George Bent, the half-breed son of William Bent of Bent's Fort, was living in the encampment with his Cheyenne wife, Magpie. This is a map that George Bent drew of the attack. He also wrote an eyewitness account of the attack. Bullets flew thick at all of us, men, women, and children. We ran. It was like running through fire. We reached the sand pits, dug against the banks. This is what saved a good many men, women, and children. That night I managed to walk 10 miles to a ravine and fell exhausted. It was very dark and cold, and those that were not wounded kept up the grass fires, as there was not wood or blankets to keep the wounded from freezing. Of course, no one slept. Wounds began to pain. I should mention that George Bent survived for another 54 years and died in 1918 during the influenza epidemic. White Antelope shouted to the soldiers, "Stop, stop," and held up his arms. As the firing intensified, according to Cheyenne and Arapaho stories, White Antelope folded his arms and calmly began to chant his death song. Nothing lives forever except the earth and the mountains. Shot through with bullets, he died in the creek bed. Scenes of horror followed. Men of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, the Indian fighters, dismounted and began butchering the dead and dying Indians, scalping them and cutting off ears and other body parts as trophies. A sense of decorum prohibits me from describing some of the atrocities they committed. As hundreds of Indians fled north up Sand Creek, soldiers on horseback charged after them and shot them down. The cannons were brought in to slaughter those taking shelter along the creek bed. Throughout the attack, Silas Sewell and his 100 men of Company D sat on their horses atop a nearby hill, observing and refusing to participate in the slaughter. Sewell realized that he and his men would probably be court-martialed, but he didn't care. His moral principles would not allow him to take part in such a terrible act. Another officer, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, also observed without taking part or allowing his men to. The attack lasted from dawn until 10 or 11 a.m. When the smoke cleared, 230 to 250 Indians lay dead. About 400 managed to escape. One Eye and Left Hand and White Antelope and other chiefs were among the dead. Shivington's losses were 7 men killed and 45 wounded. Chief Black Kettle managed to escape the slaughter, but he would be killed almost exactly 4 years later at Custer's attack at the Washita River in Oklahoma in November of '68. Many of the soldiers at Sand Creek scalped the Indians. The gruesome trophies were brought back to Denver and displayed in downtown businesses and at a Denver theater. Many of the citizens cheered Chivington and his soldiers for having at last solved the Indian problem. The Rocky Mountain News reported, Cheyenne scalps are getting as thick here now as toads in Egypt, and a Denver area theater displayed the grisly trophies on stage. Rumor has it that 2 of the Indian children who survived were brought back to Denver by the soldiers and raised by white families. After the massacre was over, both Silas Sewell and Joseph Kramer returned to Fort Lyon and wrote letters to Major Wynkoop at Fort Riley detailing the barbarity they had witnessed. This started an investigation by the Army of the massacre. And now we go to the aftermath. John Chivington had hoped to run for Congress and assumed that his attack on the Indian encampment at Sand Creek, hailed at the time as a great victory over a hostile force that endangered Denver and other eastern Colorado towns, would propel him to high office. But it did not turn out that way. In 1865, a congressional investigation began, and the report described Chivington's actions in the vilest terms possible. One officer testified, Chief Left Hand stood with his arms folded, saying he would not fight the white men as they were his friends. I told Colonel Chivington of the position in which the officers stood for Major Wynkoop's pledges to the Indians and also Major Anthony's, and that it would be murder in every sense of the word if he attacked these Indians. The officer added, bringing his fist down close to my face, Chivington told me, damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I told him what pledges were given to the Indians, and he replied, I've come to kill Indians and believe it to be honorable to kill Indians under any and all circumstances. I want no prisoners. To quote a portion of the Congressional Committee's findings, upon observing the approach of the soldiers, Black Kettle, the head chief, ran up to the top of his lodge an American flag as he had been advised to do in case he met with any troops on the prairies. And then the scene of murder and barbarity began. Men, women, and children were indiscriminately slaughtered. Not content with killing women and children who were incapable of offering any resistance, the soldiers indulged in acts of barbarity of the most revolting character, such it is hoped, as never before disgraced the acts of men claiming to be civilized. It's difficult to believe that beings in the form of men and disgracing the uniform of the United States soldiers and officers could commit or countenance the commission of such acts of cruelty and barbarity as are detailed in the testimony, but which your committee will not specify in their report. As to Colonel Chivington, your committee can hardly find fitting terms to describe his conduct. He deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre which would have disgraced the veriest savage among those who were the victims of his cruelty. The truth is that he surprised and murdered in cold blood the unsuspecting men, women, and children on Sand Creek, who had every reason to believe they were under the protection of the United States authorities, and then returned to Denver and boasted of the brave deeds he and the men under his command had performed. As a result of his testimony against Chivington, Silas Sewell was gunned down in the streets of Denver in April of 1865, possibly by Chivington's supporters. According to this plaque marking the place of his death at 15th and Arapahoe Streets, his murderers were never brought to justice. Neither was anyone else connected with the Sand Creek Massacre. Here's Silas Sewell's grave in Denver's Riverside Cemetery. It's usually decorated with flowers. Instead of ending the troubles with the Indians, the Sand Creek Massacre actually inflamed them and brought about several more decades of warfare. Here's a partial listing of some of the battles that took place after Sand Creek. I've got 3 pages of them here. These happened all across the West and the Northern Plains. The Meeker Massacre, Meeker, not too far from here, took place in 1879. After the Sand Creek Massacre, the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers went looking for revenge. They burned white settlements, attacked wagon trains, and temporarily cut off trading routes to and from Denver. In January of 1865, an Indian army of 1,000 warriors made a successful attack on Julesburg, a prominent way station on the Overland Trail in northeast Colorado, in which they killed many of the outnumbered townspeople and soldiers. Afterward, many of the Cheyenne went north to join Lakota Chief Red Cloud on the Powder River in Wyoming. Before leaving the area, they burned many South Platte River Valley homesteads. Because of his role in the Sand Creek Massacre, John Evans was removed from office in August of 1865 by President Andrew Johnson, and he died in 1897. John Chivington was never court-martialed because he had resigned from the Army in 1865 before the congressional investigation. He bounced around for many years, moving from Colorado to Nebraska and marrying his daughter-in-law. There's a story there. She divorced him in 1871, and he moved on to Omaha, then New York, Canada, California, and Ohio, finally returning to Denver, where he worked briefly as a deputy sheriff before dying of cancer in 1894. He's buried in Fairmount Cemetery in Denver, and his grave is regularly vandalized. He remained unrepentant and insisted that what he had done at Sand Creek was the right thing to do. But what's there now to see? In 2000, President Bill Clinton created the 1,500-acre Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site to mark the site of the atrocity. Here the wind blows across the plains, perhaps echoing the sighs of the men, women, and children who died there 159 years ago. A brochure from the National Park Service says the barbarism of November 29th, the Sand Creek Massacre maintains its status as one of the most emotionally charged and controversial events in American history, a tragedy reflective of its time and place. The Sand Creek Massacre lay in a whirlwind of events and issues exacerbated by the ongoing Civil War. Critically, the Sand Creek Massacre stands as a testament to a brutality that should be learned from and never repeated. A lesson of what the rejection of conscience in the face of fear and hysteria can lead to, and the suffering that this betrayal has imparted on generations of Arapaho and Cheyenne people. Despite the government's best or worst efforts, the Native Americans were not wiped out. Today, there are approximately 326 Indian land areas in the U.S. administered areas as federal Indian reservations, also known as pueblos, rancheritas, missions, villages, communities, etc. The largest is the 16 million acre Navajo Reservation located in the Four Corners area in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The life is hard in many of these isolated and desolate regions. Many Native Americans live below the poverty level and suffer from depression, alcoholism, and other substance abuse addictions. But many are also trying to preserve their tribal traditions. If you've ever attended the amazing powwow in Denver every March, how many have ever been to the powwow? It's an amazing place to go. You've seen the tribes come together to dance, chant, beat their drums, and march across the Denver Coliseum floor in a spectacular procession. Did you know that there's a Native American History Month? Do you know when it is? November, yes, the same month as the Sand Creek Massacre. Also today, there are some 5 million Native Americans, 78% of them living outside of a reservation. And we've had a number of prominent Native Americans who have served the U.S. government. You might remember Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who was a U.S. representative in Congress from Colorado and then served in the Senate from '93 to 2005. The current Secretary of the Interior is Deb Holland, who is a member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe. But I think of American natives as the invisible people. I mean, when's the last time you saw anyone who looked Native American in a print ad or a TV commercial? The last one I remember, maybe the only one, is Iron Eyes Cody, who was in the Keep America Beautiful campaign in 1971. Does anybody remember Iron Eyes Cody? Okay, yeah. Well, interesting enough that he wasn't an Indian, he was 100% Sicilian. And his real name was Espero di Corti. A little trivia fact for you there. Yeah, it seems like there's an effort to disappear certain ethnic groups. If you remember the Land O'Lakes butter carton package with the Indian maiden on it, well, she's been erased. She's no longer there. Slowly, very slowly, the terrible transgressions of the past are being rectified to a certain extent. For example, I'm sure you've all heard that Mount Evans outside of Denver was just renamed. It's now known as Mount Blue Sky, right? In Longmont, Shivington Place, or Shivington Drive, was renamed Sunrise Drive. But the almost ghost town of Shivington in Kiowa County still exists, just 9 miles from the scene of the massacre. Kind of a hopeful sign is every year in November, a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho youth make a 170-mile relay run from Sand Creek to Denver to commemorate the tragedy of Sand Creek. In closing, I just want to say, may we never forget the tragedy of Sand Creek and humbly remember that we continue to be the invaders, trespassers, and occupiers of someone else's homeland. Thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you. Thank you so much. I imagine there are some people with a few questions, or you just want to get back to the beer table and, and the whiskey to recover from a rather sobering talk tonight. Yes, ma'am.
Is the Sand Creek area privately owned, or is it?
It's the area is part of the national historic area that President Clinton declared. So the 1,500 acres there is now owned by the government and protected by the government. And managed by the National Park System, yes. Yes, ma'am.
But when you go, you are limited to where you can be because the ground is sacred.
That's a very good point. As the lady here said, when you go there, you're limited in where you can wander around because it is sacred ground to the tribes, Cheyenne and Arapaho, and so that should be respected. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What became of Kramer?
What became of Lieutenant Kramer? I don't know. My research didn't go into him, but that's a good question. I'll have to dig into that. I had a few other, whatever happened to Magpie, George Bent's wife. I don't know that either, but it's on my list of things to research. In the back there.
When did Wounded Knee happen? And were the circumstances similar to Sand Creek?
Well, the Battle of Wounded Knee, as I recall, was in the late 1870s.
1890.
Okay, 1896. It was one of the last clashes between government troops and Native Americans. And it was all, I would say, a direct result of what had happened at Sand Creek because of the ongoing conflict between the natives and the whites. Anybody else? Well, again, thank you so much for being here tonight, and hopefully Candace will invite me back for another talk sometime in the future. Thank you.